Hi there, thank you to the Saints at Ammonvale for inviting me to share a word from the Bible, and I trust it will be a help and a blessing to you. My intention in this recording is just to do a brief overview of the book of Ruth. If you're allowed to have favourite books of the Bible, Ruth is probably one of mine. And to me, at least, it's such an uplifting and encouraging book. It's a wonderful book. It's a book that is a ray of light in darkness. How often we need those rays of light, especially in a world that oftentimes seems very dark. It's a book that tells us of redemption, how a stranger to grace and to God came to him in all her need and found refuge and redemption in him. It's a book that tells us of restoration, how a bitter old woman, you might say, who had lost it all, it seems, was restored to joy and fullness through the providential dealings of God. In terms of headings, the headings I've got are courtesy of David Gilliland. I can't take credit for them, but first of all, we're going to look at the title, then the times, then the territory, then the teaching and types, then the talking, and lastly the theme. So first of all, the title. The book of Ruth is one of only two books, of course, in the Bible named after a woman, the other, of course, being Esther. And in Esther, you have a Hebrew woman in a Gentile land, and Ruth, you have a Gentile woman in the land of the Hebrews. Ruth is also the only book named after a Gentile woman. Assuming Luke was a Jew, the only other book in the Bible named after a Gentile individual is Philemon, and if that's the case, it's interesting that both these books about Gentile converts are largely to do with the subject of loyalty. Even if you include Luke as a Gentile, he too is noted for his loyalty to Paul. Then we think of the times. The time of the events. First of all, the book of Ruth bridges between the book of Judges and 1 Samuel, the time of the Judges and the time of the Kings. Right at the beginning, we read in verse 1, "Now it came to pass in the days when the judges ruled," or judges judged. So we know that the events described in Ruth occurred during the time of the judges. Of course, we know from reading Judges that the time was characterized by this saying. It says this, "In those days there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes." And you can refer to Judges 17, 18, 19 and 21 for references to that. It's amazing to think of that in the context of the darkness described in the book of Judges, that you have this nugget of gold, this diamond, a story that happens in the midst of all of that darkness. Unlike the book of Judges that precedes it, in which God deals with his people at a national level, the book of Ruth zooms right into the providential dealings in the domestic day-to-day ordinary lives of a handful of individuals. I think it's also worthy of note that it begins with a man called Elimelech, which means "my God is king." And that's how it should have been, of course. Unfortunately, as we'll see, he does not live up to his name. Each chapter varies in the time span that it deals with. In chapter 1, you could say there's 10 years in Moab. In chapter 2, you've got 1 day in the field. In chapter 3, 1 night in the threshing floor. Chapter 4, it's been suggested 10 months in Bethlehem. And then we've got the time of writing. Although the events of Ruth take place during the time of Judges, we know from chapter 4 that it must have been written at least after David had been anointed to be the king of Israel. And it's thought by many, therefore, that the book of Ruth was probably penned by Samuel. Then the territory we'll consider. The story occurs in two locations primarily. You've got Moab and then Bethlehem, Judah. First of all, we're going to think of Bethlehem. It begins by telling us that a certain man of Bethlehem, Judah, whose name was Elimelech. And we're told in verse 2 that he and his family were Ephrathites of Bethlehem. This is, of course, the same Bethlehem where Christ was born, Micah 5 verse 2 and Matthew 2 verse 1. If you turned in your Bible a few pages back and read the final chapters of Judges and the last two stories in particular, the impression of the kind of people who live in Bethlehem, Judah, is not a good one. In chapter 17 and 18, you read about a Levite from there who was marked by idolatry. In remaining chapters, you read about a concubine, and you could say she was marked by immorality. So you have idolatry and immorality in Bethlehem. Isn't it remarkable then, in Bethlehem, which of course means house of bread, we read that there was a famine. There was a literal famine, but perhaps it was symbolic of a spiritual famine. It seems despite living there, people were not satisfied. They were just representative of the nation as a whole, however, and the whole nation would be marked by idolatry and immorality during this time. It's sad when somewhere that ought to be a source of sustenance, of course, is empty. It has nothing to offer. And then the second place is Moab, or the land or the fields of Moab. Elimelech saw that there was no food in the fields of Bethlehem because of the famine, so he sought food, satisfaction elsewhere. And he thought that he and his family would be better off in the fields of Moab than in the house of bread. The Moabites and the Ammonites, of course, came about as a result of an incestuous relationship between Lot and his daughters. They represent fleshly desires. Elimelech likely had good intentions going to Moab, but did he consult God about it? No, was his decision purely driven by the desire of the flesh or for food? In verse 1, it says that they went to dwell or to sojourn in the country of Moab. And this word country is just the word for fields, the same word that is field in chapter 2. So we think of the contrast between what happens in the fields of Moab and what happens in the fields of Bethlehem. In each of the 4 chapters there is a particular setting that is relevant to each part of Ruth's story. Of course, we've thought of the fields of Moab in chapter 1, there's the fields of Bethlehem in chapter 2, the threshing floor at Bethlehem in chapter 3, and in chapter 4 you have the gate of Bethlehem. With regards to the teaching and types, what's the teaching and types of this book? What's it all about then? The book of Ruth is a wonderful account of the grace and providence of God seen in the lives of 3 individuals in particular, Naomi, Ruth and Boaz. And their names and their meanings are worthy of note. First of all, Naomi means pleasant or delightful. And then you have Ruth, which means friend. And then we have Boaz, which means in him is strength. In this book we'll see first of all Naomi's restoration, secondly Ruth's redemption, and thirdly Boaz's reputation. So Naomi's restoration. In the book of Ruth, it's easy to focus on what happens to the life of Ruth, of course, and neglect what happens to the life of Naomi. But perhaps the story of Naomi is as important, you might say, to that of Ruth. And of course they both go hand in hand. Anyway, their lives are intertwined. And Naomi's story, as we say, is one of restoration. You see her at the beginning as a widow, having lost both her sons and husband in a foreign land. And at the end of chapter 1, in verse 21, she says, "I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty." Then following Ruth's encounter with Boaz in chapter 2, things begin to change. It's the turning point in the whole story, really. And she recognizes 2 things. God has not forsaken her, or shown his God has not forsaken her, nor shown his kindness to her. She says, "Blessed be he of the Lord, who has not forsaken his kindness to the living and the dead." And then the second thing, that the man whom God had used to show such kindness, Boaz, he was a near kinsman. And she says, "This man is a relation of ours, one of our close relatives." And as a result, she begins to hope. And by the end of chapter 3, having hatched a plan for Ruth to approach Boaz to perform the duty of the near kinsman, her confidence in Boaz is sure. She says, "Sit still, my daughter, until you know how the matter will turn out, for the man will not rest until he has concluded the matter this day." In chapter 4, Boaz, having performed the duty of the near kinsman, or the kinsman redeemer, the woman of Bethlehem would say to Naomi, "May he be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age." And would say concerning her, "There is a son born to Naomi." What a wonderful example of restoration. As a type, Naomi, you might say, is a picture of Israel. There are some parallels, you might say. Just like Naomi, they went away from the Lord, they departed the land. Now Israel, of course, are back in the land, but you might say they're still bitter. They have not yet come into a personal relationship with the near kinsman. And today, God uses Gentiles, of course, to speak to the Jewish people, just like Ruth would tell Naomi about Boaz, her encounter with Boaz in the fields, and his kindness, his graciousness to her. And of course, Boaz knew about them both. One day, Israel, of course, will be fully restored, we believe, and with a true appreciation of what the Redeemer has done for them. Naomi, you could say as well, as a type of the believer who feels forsaken, perhaps. And perhaps you're listening today and maybe you feel like God has forsaken you, or you haven't heard from God, it seems, for a while. Remember the words of the Hebrew writer in chapter 13, verse 5 and 6. It says there, "Let your conduct be without covetousness. Be content with such things as you have. For he himself has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you." So we may boldly say, "The Lord is my helper, I will not fear." It wasn't the Lord, of course, who left Elimelech and his family. It was Elimelech who left to go to Moab, where the grass seemed greener. And the same is true of us at times. It's us who, of course, who wander away from God, not God who leaves us. And yes, there are times that are hard, times when he seems silent, but maybe that's because he wants us to learn something first, to come back to him, to depend on him. Remember the father in Luke 15, watching and waiting every day for his son to return. It was while he was yet a long way off that he ran and fell on his neck and kissed him. And then we have Ruth's redemption. You might say Ruth is the main character, and her story is one of redemption. And from the end of chapter 1, Ruth is always referred to as Ruth the Moabitess. She was marked, you might say, by the flesh. She was a Gentile. She was what you might say once a stranger to grace and to God. But Ruth then, we see, is also marked by her faith. She chooses to leave everything behind, everything that she knew. And we have that wonderful statement of her faith and commitment in chapter 1, verse 16 and 17, where she says to Naomi, "Entreat me not to leave you, or turn back from following after you. Wherever you go, I will go. And wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord so do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me." She is also marked by her love. She's demonstrated that by her commitment, returning to Bethlehem with her mother-in-law. But she also shows her care in providing for them both, you might say. She shows initiative, and she goes out into the fields to try and get food for them both. And that's, of course, one of the things that Boaz noticed about Ruth in chapter 2. In verse 11, it says, Boaz said to her, "It has been fully reported to me all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you have left your father and your mother and the land of your birth, and have come to a people whom you did not know before." But she also had come to love the Lord as well, of course, it seems. Boaz picked up on that in verse 12 of chapter 2. "The Lord," he says, "repay your work, and a full reward be given you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge." In Ruth, I would suggest that we have a type of the church, or a picture of the church. Her journey is the story of one of redemption, as we said. She is the Gentile bride, you might say, to the kinsman Redeemer. Ruth only enters into the blessing of redemption by Boaz because of the relation between him and Naomi. And similarly, the church received the overflowing blessings of redemption because of that new covenant that the Lord makes with Israel. Then we come to Boaz's reputation. His story is this one of reputation. First of all, what was he known for? Well, we can think of, number one, his wealth and virtue. The first time we're introduced to Boaz in the beginning of chapter 2, verse 1, he's described as a mighty man of wealth, as the King James puts it. He was obviously evidently a man who had wealth. He owned land. He was able to pay the redemption price. The word wealth too can be translated as virtue, and it's in fact the same word that is Boaz uses to describe Ruth in chapter 3 verse 11, where he calls her a virtuous woman. He certainly displayed a high moral standard, of course, ensuring that Ruth would not be abused by the men in the field, and also I would say shows his moral character in chapter 3 also. He was also known for his care. It's evident, to me at least, that Boaz had a great care for his servants. He greeted them in the most wonderful way, it seems, in chapter 2 verse 4. He says, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." And they answered, "The Lord bless you." He sought the Lord's blessing upon them, knowing that they were dependent on the Lord to provide for them. And their response shows that his servants cared for him and respected him too as a result. So he was known for his care. He was also known, of course, for his grace. He was very gracious. He more than provided not only for Ruth but also Naomi. He ensured that they never went without food, and we see that clearly in the instructions he gave to his young men in chapter 2 verse 15 and 16. It says there, "And when she rose up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, 'Let her glean among the sheaves, and do not reproach her, and let grain from the bundles fall purposely for her. Leave it that she may glean, and do not rebuke her.'" No one had a bad word to say about Boaz, as far as we can see. And he was a man of great reputation. But you could say his reputation also grew through this story of Ruth. Of course, when we come to chapter 4, when he redeems all its Naomi's and purchases Ruth as his wife, it says in verse 11 and 12, "And all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, 'We are witnesses. The Lord make the woman who is coming to your house like Rachel and Leah, the two who built the house of Israel, and may you prosper in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. May your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring which the Lord will give you from this young woman. And of course, the obvious picture in Boaz is that of Christ. His journey is one of reputation, the mighty man of wealth, the near kinsman, the kinsman redeemer. He is the one that they would say, may you prosper and be famous. So we see that in this book we have Naomi's restoration, Ruth's redemption, and Boaz's reputation. In the book of Ruth also we see there are resolutions or decisions to be made. That's one of the features of this book. We see the importance of these decisions or resolutions of individuals and the consequences that they have for them and for others. Of course, we can think of Elimelech and how he had a decision to make when the famine struck. Do they stay put or do they go? We think of Naomi had a decision to make when she heard that the Lord had visited his people by giving them bread. Would she return home? Then Ruth and Orpah, of course, had a decision to make when Naomi decided to go home. Would they stay or go with her? And then the nearest kinsman, he had a decision to make in chapter 4. Was he going to redeem? What was he going to do when he found out about Ruth as well? Was he going to redeem her? Should he not? And Boaz, of course, he had a decision to make when the nearest kinsman refused to redeem all that was Naomi's and to purchase Ruth as his wife. So would he perform the duty of the near kinsman? The consequences of their decisions would not only affect them, of course, but in the providence of God would have implications for the nation and ultimately for the whole world. We see the interplay between God's purposes and human decisions, or between God's sovereignty and human responsibility. We also see relationships at play here, the different relationships that we read about. And just of note, of course, is that one between Naomi and Ruth. That's perhaps one of the main ones that we read about, between a mother-in-law and a daughter-in-law. And it seems to me that whilst Naomi did have an affection for both Orpah and Ruth, it was only after Ruth declaring her commitment to her mother-in-law that we see that relationship grow much deeper. Ruth's declaration or devotion is like that of a salvation moment, I would say. We see, of course, Ruth's love for Naomi in chapter 4, verse 15. We can also think about the talking, and a large proportion of this book is dialogue. The first words recorded by these three main characters, I think, are particularly worthy of note, and they give us a bit of an insight into the character of these people. So, of Naomi, the first words, I believe, verse 8 and 9, go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest each in the house of her husband. And so I would suggest Naomi there is marked by her humility. And then with regards to Ruth, her first words, of course, that we've already quoted, chapter 1, verse 16 and 17, where she says, entreat me not to leave you or turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. And where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. So Ruth is marked by her devotion, I would say. And then we think also of Boaz, what he says to Ruth in chapter 2, verse 4. Boaz came from Bethlehem, and he said to the reapers, we see Boaz speaking in chapter 2 verse 4, and he says to the reapers, "The Lord be with you," and they answered, "The Lord bless you." So the Boaz is marked by his graciousness and his kindness. And then lastly we think of the theme. The book of Ruth concludes with a genealogy, and it's the genealogy of David. The fact that the genealogy is at the end tells me that one of the main reasons we have this account is because all of these events, all of these decisions that have been made would ultimately lead to a little boy being born who would go on to be the king of Israel. David was quite possibly the king at the time of writing. The genealogy is important because, number one, it establishes that David is from the tribe of Judah. Perez or Phares, King James I think translates it as the oldest son of Judah, and that's Genesis 38, and it was of Judah that it was said, "The scepter shall not depart from Judah," that's Genesis 49 verse 10. And secondly, it's important because it forms part of the genealogy of Christ, of course, in Matthew chapter 1. And he is, of course, as the hymn writer would put it, great David's greater son. He is the Lion of the tribe of Judah. So the Ruth begins with death, it begins with death and bitterness, but it ends with life and joy. If you were to ask for an outline, I would suggest verse 1 to 5. In chapter 1 you have the decision of Elimelech. Chapter 1 verse 6 to 18 you have the devotion of Ruth. Chapter 1 verse 19 to 22 the commotion of Bethlehem. Chapter 2 verse 1 to 23, so the whole chapter 2 is, I would say, the provision of Boaz. And then chapter 3 you have the proposition of Ruth. In chapter 4 verse 1 to 12 you have the redemption by Boaz. Chapter 4 verse 13 to 17 the celebration of the people. And then chapter 4 verse 18 to 22 the generation of David. So that's just a brief overview and outline of the book of Ruth. I hope it's been helpful. I've certainly enjoyed going through the book of Ruth recently myself, and there's much to enjoy, to encourage, just to meditate on. Hopefully this will give you a flavour, just a taste as it were, so that you can go away and enjoy it a bit more in detail yourself. So thank you again, and trust that the Lord will bless